Lance Jackson, thank you so much for giving me your time, mate. You are Lupset born and bred, and
yeah.
We were chatting earlier. Obviously, you were talking about your wedding anniversary, but it's also the anniversary of, dare I say it, Wakefield's most notorious son. I interviewed you years ago for one of the books. Really good chapter. So just before we start that, Lance, what's your background? Obviously, so you grew up in Wakefield, Lupset. Am I right in saying the Lupset estate is the biggest council estate in Europe?
I believe it was at that time. I don't know that it's been surpassed since, Jamie, but at that time, yeah, it was the biggest council estate in Europe.
Right, okay. I mean, for those, I've spent a lot of time there over the years. For those who aren't familiar with it, what's Lupset like? Back then, and what's it like now?
I suppose it's like a lot of places when you live in, Jamie, and are sort of deemed rough by other people. It was just normal for us. It was just a normal. I didn't consider myself to be growing up in a deprived area or anything. And our neighbours were friendly. We had, throughout, lads from all over the estate. We had a little gang, I suppose you'd call it now, called the Townley Road Mafia, TRM.
Yeah.
We used to meet, there were these shops on Townley Road. We always used to meet around there when we were younger kids. Growing up on Lupset, I enjoyed it, and it's only when you look back retrospectively and you think, oh hell, that were rough. Like some people fighting on the roadside sometimes when you were coming home, and things like this. But it just seemed normal to us because I guess we'd not seen anything else.
I was talking to Gavin Etworth the other week, lovely man, and he said obviously you mentioned you. Were you a bit of a boxer then, Lance, years ago? A bit sporty then?
Well, I was a hammer thrower when I was younger, but I was a power lifter, and I was the Yorkshire and North East Divisional powerlifting champion in 1982, lifting at 110 kilograms. So I loved all sport. I was involved in all sport, but as I got older, it was mainly my strengths lie in strength athletics. So I was a hammer thrower, and as I say, and a power lifter. But I played rugby a lot. But I stopped playing rugby sort of in my early 20s because of the injuries you get around your legs, getting all knocks and stuff like this. Wasn't conducive to being a good hammer thrower or a good power lifter. So I stopped that. I stopped rugby in my early 20s. But I always enjoyed playing rugby. And my dad, my stepdad, was a guy called Fred Smith, and he was a winger for Wakefield Trinity, and he still holds the record at Wakefield Trinity for tries in a match in a season. Played at Wembley twice in the 60s, won 2 Challenge Cup medals. So he was my stepdad, but he was really quite famous, and so I think maybe there were a part of me that didn't fancy sort of trying to compete with his prowess and name on the rugby field. So yeah.
am I right in saying rugby is huge in Wakefield?
Oh, it's massive, and back then there were loads of really good amateur sides. My granddad on my biological father's side, he was like the president of this club called Brookhouse Rugby League, and they had a rugby league club. A really good amateur club, but there were lots of good amateur clubs back then, and the team. Wakefield Trinity were a very successful team in the 60s and 70s, 60s particular, and then in the late 50s as well. And that's when my stepdad Fred, that's when he played for him. He played from late 50s through to early 60s, and as I say, he's still got the record now for a number of tries in a match and in a season.
So for the last couple of years, there's been a lot of, Paul Sykes has kind of been that, I suppose, crazy guy on YouTube talking about punching sharks in the ear. And, you know, he's kind of got, I suppose, a bit of, I know it's very bit late for him now, but he's got a lot of limelight. He's got a lot of attention. But obviously back in Wakefield, certainly in Lupset, he was just part of the furniture. But going back, obviously Paul was 10 years older than you. When was the first time you heard that name? When did you kind of become familiar with that guy, Paul Sykes?
It's a really interesting question, Jamie. I didn't really hear about Paul Sykes until I was about 18, I think. That'd be about 1976. And he was due out of prison. I think he'd served a relatively lengthy sentence. But he was due out, and there were a lot of people talking about this.
He was released in March 77.
Brilliant. Yeah, that'd be about right then. Yeah, so sort of late 76. I turned 18 in October 76. So there were a lot of talk, Paul Sykes is getting out of Nick. And, you know, who's Paul Sykes? And everybody's talking about how hard he was and things like this. So that was the first time I'd sort of come across the name. But I was going out with a girl called Wendy Doggett.
Yeah.
At the time when he came out of Nick. And she nice lass, Wendy. I don't have a wrong to say about her at all. But she was somebody who wanted a bit of a name. And I, not by any stretch of the imagination, were I as infamous as Paul Sykes. But I suppose in my own little circle, I was quite well known. And so, I think that's what Wendy liked about me, really. And then when Sykesy came out with Nick, she didn't take up with him officially. It was a lass called Kath who took up with him, and she was only 15 with this Kath, and Wendy were about the same age, a little bit older, maybe.
I mean, for those who aren't aware, Lance, obviously he had 3 wives. So obviously Wendy was one, Kath was one, and Pauline was the other lovely lady. I've been to stay with her a couple of times, but obviously he married them, and so for you were dating Wendy basically before Paul.
Yeah. And she dumped me, and next thing she'd taken up with him. And so the first time I actually encountered Paul Sykes, this would be shortly after his first fight with Malpass. And it was
78.
Yes, it would be. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, 77, 78-ish. Yeah. Anyway, he'd had that fight with Malpass. This was the first time I ever came face to face with him. And the rumour going round that he were looking for me. I can only assume that it was something to do with Wendy or going out with. Anyway, so I mean, as foolhardy as this is going to sound, I saw him. He was in a shop on Park Lodge Lane in East Moor, and coincidentally, me and John Purvis, we were walking past it, and somebody says, "Oh, there's Sykesy in there." So I thought, well, I'm not going to wait for a tap on the shoulder and a smack round look. So I went in and introduced myself to him basically, and he'd had this fight with Malpass. So I went to shake his hand, and he says, "Yeah," he said, "but go gentle because my hands are sore from fight last night." And I said, "Well, I'm Lance Jackson, and you know, I hear you wanting a word with me." So he just looked at us. He said, "No, I'm not wanting a word with you." So it was just a vicious rumor that were going around. But that was the first time, and I'd ever met him, and I thought, "Thank fuck he didn't want to." Want to have a go at me, because I mean, I'm no midget myself, but I mean, he must have had about 3 inches in height on me, and he was a big fit bloke, you know, and so I was rather glad that he hadn't decided that he was going to avenge himself against his girlfriend's former suitor, as it were.
I mean, obviously, you got quite familiar from over the years. I mean, everyone in the town knew him. And obviously, from then on, I mean, he was always in and out of prison. I mean, I worked out once with, I I think it was one of his wives, that he died 2 months off 61. And I think we worked out that he actually did something like 27 years behind the door, 26 years, something I can't remember off the top of my head.
I had the figure. When he came out of Nick that time, there was something to the effect that he'd spent something like 26 out of 29 years in Nick or something. Like
no, it was 21 out of 26. So that was in 1990, right. September 89, September the 11th. Yeah, that was that. You know, he'd. You know, the experts say any man who spends 10 years or more is changed for the worst. And obviously he was a seriously disturbed individual.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you actually had nights out with him and everything. And was he as scary as kind of what the books have portrayed than that?
Oh, yeah. And then some. I mean, I've always maintained, Jamie, that Paul Sykes didn't have any friends. People say that our Paul Sykes' friend. He didn't have any friends. He had a lot of sycophants. Because at the end of the day, if you were out with Paul Sykes, he was just as likely to smack you one at the end of the night as he was anybody else. There was one notorious incident where he went out with a mate of his, a big wrestler. Forgot his name.
Yeah, Mick Sellers.
Mick, that's it. That's him.
Yeah.
And he went out with him. So obviously, you know, two pals out on town, have a few beers, and then I had a ruck, and I think he bit his ear off or something like this.
Yeah, he did.
And that's what I mean when I say he didn't have any friends, because he hit people who were supposedly his friends as readily as he did anybody else. So a lot of people were sycophants. I hate bullying. I absolutely detest bullying. I was bullied as a kid at school, and as I grew bigger and a bit more formidable, I won't bully anymore. But I had a strong distaste for people who were bullies, and Paul Sykes was a bully. He was a very intelligent, articulate man. There's no doubt about that. But he was a bully, and I only had one real night out with Paul Sykes, because, as I say, I wouldn't have ever sought his company. And I'd come home, I were on leave from the army, and it was one of them sort of midweek days. It'd be a Tuesday or a Wednesday, you know, a note day where it's sort of there's nobody uptown. And I thought I'd just call into Strafford Arms for a pint. I've gone in Strafford Arms, and it's empty by one person. Who is it? Sykesy. Oh, shit. So I've got my beer, and he comes up to me. Hey up, Lance. So I said, hey, Paul, you know, how you doing? Just change a few pleasantries. And I said, anyway, I'm gonna get down. Oh no, come on, stop out with me. Stop out. We'll have a few beers. So I thought, for fuck's sake. So anyway, we went out, but at the end of that night, I almost felt like I needed a shower, because it was just like everywhere you went, he never paid for it. So every pub we went into, he'd order beer, they'd say, 2 pints for me and him, and but he never paid. And I used to think, well, I remember thinking to myself, these people are going to think I'm like that. These people are going to think that I'm, like this guy, and there's no way that I was. Anyway, we ended up all night, didn't pay for it all night. Went in Tiffany's nightclub, didn't pay in there, obviously. And then we come out, and he said, "Oh, you got to come back to my house, Lance. I'll show you my house, my bachelor pad. But I live there with Wendy. She'll love to see you and all this." And I thought, "Oh, fucking bet she'll love to see me." And he'd got this reputation on Sykesy for basically raping young prisoners in Nick. I don't know whether it were true. It's not something I've pursued. You probably know this better than me, but he had this.
Yeah, I mean, do you know what? I've spoken to. So you saw the documentary, you know the guy at the start with the beard up to here. So he was obviously he was the whole governor, but he was also the Home Secretary of Offenders, and I was with him about 17 months ago, and I quizzed him. Listen, I did books on Jack the Ripper, Lee Duffy, Roy Shaw, Dominic Negus, a few other unpleasant characters I'd rather forget. I've got no connection with him. I didn't know him. And, I interviewed the chief of West Yorkshire Police about 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago. And there's just no records of it. And so I've been into prisons, and I interviewed his son, and I've interviewed his best friends and his sisters, and they said, listen, he was gay for the state. I remember Paul Jr. saying to me, he said, if our dad was here, he'd admit it. He'd say, yes, I have sex with men. Right. John Spencer was very close to him, and Paul told, all the page 3 things and all. That's where that came from. Right. But there's a lot of people on the internet didn't know him and tell tall stories. For instance, the Lee Duffy stories was utter nonsense. Right. And that was confirmed by people who they only ever met twice. But, there's no doubt. Listen, he was indulging homosexual activity. Yeah. It was only something he did on the inside. Certainly, I know a few people who are certainly proposition, but he had a huge sexual appetite, and but it was something, but as for rape, there's just no evidence other than just bullshitters on the internet kind of making stories up.
Yeah. I don't care what goes on between consenting adults, whether they're in jail or not, but how this night ended, when we were out, we were talking about different things, and I was telling him about hammer throwing and stuff like this, and he sort of put his hand on front of my chest and another hand on my back, and he went, "Oh, you are a big bloke, aren't you?" So and I remember feeling quite uncomfortable with that. But when we got back to his house that night, I ended up going back, and Wendy were in. So when we got back to his house, he'd bear in mind he'd had a few by this time, and he started getting a little bit, a bit sneery and a bit not the bloke I'd just been out having a few pints with.
Yeah.
So he said, and I think he said something to the effect, I'll let you two former lovebirds have a chat. Hang on. First of all, he went out, and then he came back in front room just in his underpants. So I thought, this is fucking charming, isn't it? I mean, what do you say? And so he said, I'll leave you two lovebirds to have a chat. I'll be back in a minute. So he's gone out of the room. Wendy turned around and looked at me. She says, Lance, go. I said, yeah. She says, go now. So I heeded the warning and I went. And I never actually was one-on-one in his company ever again after that. And I never, obviously, I never discussed it with him because I never really talked to him after that. But I remember
the story in the book. Actually, Wendy said to you, didn't she? Said, "Look, Lance, I've seen this a few times and it doesn't end well." Yeah.
That was, yes, that's exactly it. I guess she knew what, and I don't know what his idea was. But I mean, it's like this, Jamie. You come to my house, and you come and sit down. I guarantee you, I'll not come walking back in my underwear, and start, talking about how you and Mrs. used to be an item. It's just not, it's just not the done thing, is it?
And obviously, you must, we'll get to the bit at the end. I'm speaking to a guy tomorrow who literally helped him about a week before he died. He scraped him off the road, I think he said to him. But obviously, his demise was huge. And over the years, obviously, from those experiences in the late 70s and the 80s, he was in Stranger Ways. Early 80s, 5 years for the union rep. Then he done the burglary and then flattened 2 screws. So he was in there from 85 to 89. So kind of the 80s, he was kind of, well away, not various prisons across across England.
Yeah.
What was your experiences like with him after that then?
Well, that was his, I suppose, like as you say there, the 80s, he was sort of what his heyday. And I know he'd had, I think his last professional fight he'd lost in Nigeria or something like this.
So that was March 1990.
Right. Okay. So he packed in professional boxing, but he was still very notorious around town.
Mm-hmm.
And he would. I mean, basically, he could clear the pub faster than any man I know. Because if he came in, nobody wanted to be in his company when he was drinking. But me and Gavin, who you mentioned earlier on, Gavin Epworth, we had we had a company, a security company called Masterguard.
Yeah,
and we trained dogs. And we also did like security on doors, right? With a quite a few nightclubs and stuff that we had, and we did personal protection as well. But at that time, have you come across Les Carr?
Yeah, a lovely guy. I'm going to speak with him soon. I met him. I speak to him now and again. I'm hoping he's going to come on. But I mean, I think it was. I'm very familiar with a lot of names in Wakefield, and he's kind of widely recognised, him and Bob Tucker, as the only people who could actually physically be capable of dealing with Sykes.
Les Carr was he's a big man, as you know. He's about 6'2". I've never known a man who could use his feet, that size, who could use his feet like Les Carr. I mean, he was a very, very skillful martial artist, as was Gavin. Gavin was a very skillful martial artist. But Les Carr, I mean, he really was and I think if I were a gambling man, he'd be the one person that I've come across who I'd think to myself, yeah, he could have handled Sykesy, because he could use his feet as well, could Les. So, I mean, if you're fighting a bloke like Paul Sykes, you don't want to be, exchanging punches with him. But I think that Les would have probably took him out with his legs, and he, as I say, he would a formidable presence with Les Carr. But the antithesis really of Sykes, because Les Carr is a big hard man, but a gentleman.
He's a lovely guy. So's Chris Campbell as well.
Right. I don't know. I know of Chris, but I don't really know him. But I went down to. I remember he said Gavin had told him a little bit about me, and me and a lad called Brian Ford went down to Les's dojo to train, and apparently Gavin had said to him, "Oh well, Lance, he can pull 5-ton trucks. I've been in like a lorry pulling contest with Jeff Capes. Lance can pull 5-ton trucks," and Les Carr must have said to him, 5-ton trucks don't hit back."
Yeah. And obviously, Sykesy's decline, particularly from about 94. I mean, he started getting a few good hidings. Obviously he was a name. He didn't become a drunk. So his parents died within 12 weeks of each other. Wow. One was September, the other one was November, and then Calf left him, and it was almost, I think I described it in the book as Cinderella moment. Right. Basically, Pumpkin, obviously, and then obviously I think he was in Stanley Royd for a bit, which was probably the last Fieldhead, that was it, yeah.
Yeah.
I know he was on them pellets that George Best was on, that basically. In fact, there was only 24 hours difference between them. And basically, from about 2002, he's arthritis, he had diabetes, and obviously things as bad as it got probably from about 2000. Well, I'll tell you the picture of him with like the jazz hands and there's about 8 coats. So that was taken in November 2004. I actually spoke to the reporter who took that. Right. And the picture of him where he's kind of been set on fire. So that was September 2005. And, he was basically a gush of wind would have blew him over. Um,
what happened to him at the end of his life, Jamie? It was tragic. I mean, you'd see him. I mean, by this time, like it were sort of further on in the 90s, and you'd go into town, and it was round town, you know, first thing in the morning, like market, drunk, you know, pissing in flipping public, shouting and bawling at people, and he were hard to look at when you knew what he'd been like. Because as I say, I didn't like the man, but you have to. He was a formidable physical presence, and as I say, it really an articulate, intelligent bloke when he were right in his mind. But he were. I stumbled across him a few times. Well, he stumbled across my path a few times, and he was forever drunk. He didn't recognise me. And he just became a nuisance. And then you'd hear about these younger lads, but people, you'll come across folk now and again who'll say, "Oh yeah, I walked Sykesy up." I always ask him, what era did you wall him up? You know, because it wouldn't have been when he were at his peak. It wouldn't have been in the 70s and 80s when they walled him up. It was when he was a decrepit, helpless old man. And it was awful, really, what happened to him, because any young punk who wanted to make a bit of a name for himself or whatever, they'd set about Sykesy, you know. And like I say, he were way, he couldn't defend himself even. It was just, you know, it was bullying. I'd heard it. I never actually saw results of him being set off, but I'd heard he'd been somebody that set him on fire and all. I mean, it was really awful. I mean, you wouldn't wish it on anybody. But
I mean, can I ask you, Lance? Obviously, you knew him when he was at his scariest, and obviously, you knew him when he was a shell of it, when he was basically someone who used to be Paul Sykes.
Yeah.
And was there any feeling in Wakefield that people, you know, because they knew he was such a bar steward, that basically this is his karma, life's come 360? Because the actor who has verbally accepted to play Sykes actually said to me, he said, that's the thing that really interests me. He said, it's plain, I think the words he used was the social justice side of things, life from 360. You know, basically, what was Wakefield's theory on it? Was it like, good, this is what you've got, this is what you deserve?
There were no overall consensus. I mean, obviously, people had different opinions. There were a lot of people who sort of voiced that opinion that you just said there, Jamie. You know, well, he's getting his just desserts. You know, karma's a bitch in it and all this. For me, no matter what I thought about the man, nobody deserves that. Nobody deserves to finish their days in the way that he did. A target for every young punk who wanted to make a little bit of a name for himself by saying he'd beaten up Paul Sykes. I think from people, I mean, I think if you talk to people like Gav Epworth and that, they'll, and myself, we just, I didn't take any pleasure in hearing how he'd been dealt with and how he was being treated and stuff. I won't wish it on anybody. So I don't think there were. I think it was quite divided into two camps. You either thought, well, he would have prick all of his life and he got what he deserved at the end, or if you had a little bit of compassion, you thought, well, actually, nobody deserves that. Nobody deserves.
Yeah, I mean, I remember speaking to. I have probably spoke to about 4 police officers over the years, and they said our feeling in Wood Street, Nick, obviously it's not there now, it's gone. He said half the station were like good, and then half the people were in shock.
Yeah,
because it was almost like Dracula. It was almost like they didn't think he could die. That's what they said to me. Right. And you know, when you think of, I remember speaking to one police officer, and he said, I knew him when the full shift of Wood Street Nick had to go deal with him.
Yeah.
And then I knew him when a gush of wind would have blew him over.
Yeah.
And obviously he couldn't fight by then, but he was still nasty. He still had a wicked. He was always kind of spitting at people, or he was a nasty piece of work. And I mean, what's your feeling as obviously not only a Wakefield man, but a Lupset lad? So on 18 years to the day since he died. There's a lot of interest in him. I've spoken to, I remember chatting to Ricky Gervais once on Twitter. Right. Jamie Carragher, the filmmakers of Paul Sykes at large, they said to me, Robbie Williams come up and said, it's Martin O'Neill, another one, just fascinated with this guy.
Yeah.
And it's not glamorizing it, because obviously he's part of your social history, whether you like that or not. And in my head, when I think of Wakefield, I think of Paul Sykes, or I think of Jay McDonald. And he certainly puts Wakefield on the map to a lot of people. What's your thoughts on him? How are you going to feel when there's a film and he's in? You know what I mean? It's your town.
Yeah, I mean, as a social scientist myself, his story is fascinating. I mean, if you can remove yourself from any personal involvement and just look at it objectively, he is a fascinating case in point, this Paul Sykes. But he was definitely the author of his own downfall. And I think, to be honest, Jamie, the stuff that I've read that you've done, seen the documentaries you've done, and some of the other notorious characters, I think you present it in a very fair way. And I don't think that people, I can't imagine why people would be in any way take offense. I'm suspecting you're not going to be glamorizing him, but at the end of the day, that's what happened. That's what sort of man he was when he was younger and in his prime. Sober, he was articulate, and he was educated. I mean, he'd put his time in Nick to some good use. I think it's something like 42 O levels or something like this.
A levels, O levels. He had a degree. He had an education a school teacher couldn't hold a torch to, but he also had a degree in violence. To say. I mean, I remember. I was talking to his brother-in-law about a year or two ago, and he said he was the most intelligent man I've ever met, but he said he was the most violent. He said, obviously, his upbringing, he was really disturbed. It wasn't only his father; it was his mother as well. And obviously, that was
I didn't know.
Yeah. She was like, I mean, I've got the recordings from his sister telling me she was like a size 9 feet, so she was like a man. And as these days, he was born in 1946, so being brought up in the 50s, he would have been put into care. I've got absolutely no doubt.
Yeah, today, absolutely.
That's just not a normal.
No,
not a normal upbringing. Even by the 70s, people grew up and your dad beat you up, and it was just something that you got on with. Your dad was an alcoholic and he beat you up, and it was, But I remember one of his best friends said to me, he wasn't born, he was made. He was almost like created, like Frankenstein. A very damaged, emotionally broken little boy who, became arguably an absolute. I'll tell you one thing though, as well, which I discovered. So his mother had a craving for wheat. And the experts have done you can Google this, that, women can have all kinds of cravings. I know someone who had a craving for eating firelighters. And when the woman, she literally used to eat shredded wheat, just raw. And that can make a baby violent, extremely violent.
Really?
And Actually, when he was born, it was thunder and lightning. That's like straight up. That's no joke.
Right.
But you know, how should he be remembered? You know, he's written in folklore, mythical. You know, as the years go on, the tall stories come, and you've read the 3 books.
Yeah.
You know, that's the research for the film. The film starts 1989, September the 11th, and it finishes on March the 7th, 18 years ago today. So that's what I'm told. The film starts when he's 43, and it ends when he's 60. You know, obviously it's gonna take one incredibly skilled actor to to play that. But you know, how should he be remembered? You knew him, you saw him, you heard all the tales. You know, back in the 80s, half the population had, and then maybe it's even less in Lupps, had landlines. And he was famous. He was kind of the celebrity in the town. There was no social media, but everybody knew that name, Paul Sykes.
Yeah.
And one of the police officers, I think I put it in the book, I can't remember. I think it was the chief of West Yorkshire Police. He said to me, I've met all the kind of characters in life and all the criminals. And he said, you know, all the tough guys in Leeds, and they come up and they go, do you know who I am? And he said, all the criminals I was around, he said, Sykes never needed to do that. He said, you knew who he was because you knew who he was. You know, you see them these days on YouTube, old bullshitters wearing American football tops. Yeah. And they're just sat dressing like paper boys, telling tales. Do you know what I mean? And it's like, you know, he was you know, listen, I have no emotional ties to him any more than I do on Jack the Ripper. Never met him, never heard of him till I was 5 years after he died. But you've read the books. I mean, what's your take on it? You know, there was actually people in there, Lance, right, who when I met sat and cried in front of me. Really? And then there was people who revelled and said, glad I'm good, the bastard, and all this. And you know, I didn't know him, so I think I did the start and I did the end. But the guts were people like yourself, Chris Campbell, your Gav Atworths, and obviously a lot of other famous and infamous, your Johnny Nelsons, your Peter Furies, your Glenn McCrory's, your Chris Lambrianos, your Eddie Richardsons, and then a lot of the Lupps at estate. Do you know what I mean? So there was the famous, infamous, notorious care workers. What was your take on the books, being truthful?
I really enjoyed him. I enjoyed his biography. When I first read that, I mean, it was, you know, it was quite, well, I think it was well written. It represented what he was. I think he I don't think he sugarcoated anything. I think there was that sort of implication that in the Gardner fight somehow he'd been doped and all this, and by his, I don't know who his accusation were against, but he sort of implied that.
Let me tell you for a fact. So the fight before Gardner, he was 15 stone 8.
Right.
Now, when did he fight Gardner? June, and then he fought. I think it was about 2 months before. And when he fought Gardner, he was 14 stone 11. Right. Now, a guy called Dr. McGill, right. Dr. Ken McGill, and he was an old doctor. He actually pulled Lee Duffy's bullet out of his knee. Tommy Harrison got him. Oh. And, you know, he was an old boxer himself, bit of, I suppose, maybe a celebrity villain doctor. He knew Mad Frankie Fraser and all this. And he actually gave Paul pure oxygen before the fight. Now, that, you know, you've all seen boxers getting knocked out and they have it. Pure oxygen will weaken you. You know, I interviewed Janet Sellers, who was Mick's wife. Yeah. And he said for the whole camp, he sat at our house drinking whiskey. You know, he basically shot his bolt in that fight. You know, he told John Spenceley and John told me, and for that, obviously it was a 15 round fight. It ended 6 rounds, but for the first 3 rounds, it was 50-50.
Yeah.
And he basically, you know, he headbutted Malpass. He had his pair suspended, and he didn't want to do that, and he turned his back. I don't think it would have been called off today, 46 years on. But yeah, you know, Gardner was taken over, and he never lived that down, did Sykes? You know, the prison system, the screws it was humiliation. And I spoke to the boxing writer Colin Hart, and he was finished after that. Certainly in this country, he had one fight and it was abroad, and you know, he basically, you know, it's like being a grass if you're a criminal, and he basically was a coward. He turned his back, and his credibility was gone in Great Britain, certainly in a boxing sense.
Yeah.
You know, I met John Gardner a couple of times, and he always got messages to him. You know, we'll have a fight in a field and all this, and you know, John wasn't like that. He was a law-abiding citizen.
Yeah.
And he just said, "Look, I've beat you once. I don't need to beat you again." But you know, I mean, so you're still in Wakefield now. Is he still spoken of today? You know, 18 years on from his death.
I actually, Jamie, I live in the Midlands now.
All right, okay.
But I do get up to Wakefield because some of my kids still live there. I think for me, in a lot of ways, if I look objectively at it, and take my personal animosity towards him out of the equation, I think that he was a product of his environment. I think he was brutalized as a child. He grew. He was a big fella growing up, and so all of his self-worth came from his physical attributes in many ways, that he could beat people up. And for all of his educational attainments, he still only knew one way out to settle an argument. If he were losing an argument, he'd smack you up. And I think that it's a shame, because had Paul Sykes been brought up in another environment, he could have been an academic. He could certainly have been a top-class athlete, because he was one of these people who was very naturally physically gifted. But I mean, obviously, alcohol took its toll. I think even throughout his professional fighting days, he was still probably drinking. After he stopped, alcohol and in the end, it consumed him. And so there you have this man who for me, it's a monumental waste of talent. He could have been academically successful. He could have been successful in the world of sports, and he could have lived a useful life and died a peaceful life. And instead, what he'll be remembered for more than anything, I think, is the way that his demise came about, and how at the end of his life, a shadow of his former physical self, he was just a target for every bully young kid who wanted to make a name for himself. And he died under awful circumstances, and it were killing him for years with alcohol. And
yeah, I remember Paul Jr. And obviously, I mean, there's 7 children I'm aware of. I'm not going to name him. Obviously, it's not my. Yeah. But he has 7 sons, 7 biological sons. Obviously, 2 are doing life for murder, and one of them was arrested 2008, but one was arrested 2004. And the weeks before he was arrested, I think the last time we spoke to him, and he said, "You know what? I didn't want to wake up today." He just, you know, he certainly, I think the feeling in Wakefield was when he died, it was like, it was almost as if, how did you last so long?
Yeah.
You know, because he'd have been 78 years old now. He'd have been 79 in May. And, you know, when he died, 60, but he looked 88.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
you know, if he'd done any wrong in life, I'm not exaggerating when I say this, that he was paid back 1,000 times.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
you know, and
nobody deserved to go out how he did, Jamie. I think, and it is sad. I mean, as I say, I'll repeat what I said earlier on. I think you'll probably find Wakefield divided in. It's like Marmite, really. You know, on the one side you'll have people say he deserved it, and that's what you get for living a life like he lived. On the other side, you'll have people who've got a bit of compassion and say, you know, actually nobody deserves that. But I search in vain to find anything nice that I could say about him, you know, personally and from what I've heard about, because I can't. He was undoubtedly a bully. He was somebody who you know, settled all of his disagreements with his fists, and he was very formidable with those. And I think he caused and wreaked havoc wherever he went round town. But I mean, as I say, having said that, I took no pleasure. I don't know out of the way that he died. I think it was.
I mean, do you know what? It wasn't only him in Wakefield. There was the other characters. Colin Beaumont was a really dangerous. You know, I'm kind of almost similar to Sykes. He actually nearly murdered Sykes with a bar stool. And obviously, you've got, you know, the other ones. The Rileys. You've got the Paul Burks. You know, Wakefield's was it's a small city, and I think it's only a city because you've got the cathedral.
Yeah.
But it's a real rough. It's a tough place to be brought up.
It could be, yeah. But you know, I mean, on the other hand, you know that I'm not saying that everybody is able to lift themselves out of that. But I was a kid, Jamie, who got in trouble with the police. You know, like all my mates. And I spent time in a detention centre when I was 14. I spent time in a borstal when I was 17. And I remember saying, I got out of borstal. I was determined I wasn't going to get in any more trouble. I got a decent job because I'm quite good educationally. And I remember we got involved basically in a fight in the town centre one night. A policeman got assaulted. We got done for a fray. Assault police ABH I got done for. And we were in Wakefield Crown Court, and I thought, I'm going down here. And my employers had wrote us a reference for me. And thank goodness I got a judge that day who were fair. And he said, you know, I would normally send you to prison. He said, I'm going to sentence you to 6 months imprisonment, but I'm going to suspend it for 2 years. I remember walking out of that court then, and my stepdad said to me, Lance, you know what? You will never stay out of trouble if you stay in Wakefield, and it'll inevitably get involved in a fight in town. And he said, you need to do something. And there's something that I did, Jamie, where I joined the army. And the army took me out of the environment. It reminded me that I was an intelligent man. And I went in for ages, but when I came out, I went to university. And again, I accept not everybody has that kind of option. And I did well for myself. But I too could have been one of those people that were in and out of jail and things like this all of his life. But I think when I look at somebody like Paul Sykes, with that kind of intelligence that he had, because he was intelligent, Paul Sykes, with that kind of physical prowess, there should have been, Jamie, an exceptional human being, somebody who had the capacity to be an exceptional human being. And instead, he turned out the way that he did. And he died the way that he did. And
yeah,
I think
if anyone's
a human tragedy.
Yeah, if anyone's got any questions for Lance, the last 10 minutes, put him on a screen. I'll ask him. My research, my theory was that he was a narcissistic sociopath.
Yeah.
Was he mad? Was he bad? I think he definitely suffered some kind of ADHD. So apparently I remember his sister saying to me, he'd been tested by every prison in Britain and all the doctors, and apparently he wasn't, but he had such a huge ego that, if you weren't on his wavelength or you didn't know the capitals, he didn't have any patience with you, and he would be like, right, you F off and you simpleton and all this. And, well, I think what's the word is a egomaniac. He was full of himself.
At least academic bullies or physical bullies. I think they're both despicable.
But absolutely. Right. But I do know personally firsthand from being around one of his wives and his sister and nieces and sons that, the one thing he didn't want to be was like his parents or certainly like his father. But he ended up being worse. Without a shadow of a doubt, he left a lot of broken people. I spoke to a lot of people who I can't even name as well. Like people who lived over the road, people who live next door. And they've said, "Look, I'll tell you this, but I don't." And it just wasn't normal the way he behaved and went around his life. And how do you get past 1 year, 2 year, 5 year, 10 year and think, I'm sick of this crap? But, he was a very, very intelligent man. But, to spend most of your life in prison, it was the same as another character I studied and I did 3 books on and a couple of documentaries, Duffy. So he was inside prison in that kind of Neanderthal world, if you like. They were royalty, they were gods, and they had that kind of
books. That right, the way, Jamie. Fascinating series of books, that mate. And
so, did you read the Duffy ones?
I read, and I also watched your documentary that you'd done when you talked to people who known him and things like that.
Yeah, same again. People I didn't know him. Very similar life. Yeah. Obviously, he died, which is quite. Yeah. Well, the thing is, probably the scariest thing with Duffy and the most astonishing thing was he died 5 years before his prime. That's quite a scary. You think if he'd have lived 27, 28, 29, how many other lives would he have killed someone? We'll never know. Could he have turned his life around? The one thing with Sykes was he did find God in the end. I know at the start it was for free biscuits and coffee and all that kind of thing. But, I remember talking to Graham Seed and I remember being in the church actually where he was buried and where he used to go. And, he was very, very rude at the start. And in the end, he would read the Bible and, he knew death. Certainly from 2004, he was kind of wanting to die, didn't want to be here. Right. And I don't know. Listen, there's people who are we to judge. I've been in prison, Lance. You and we've all done really stupid things in life.
Yeah.
So none of us can kind of judge. But wherever he is now, I remember talking to his sister, and she went to a spiritualist church, actually. And she said, right, I've got a man here, an old man, and he's got dogs around you. So straight away, that was a dad. And then, I've got this strong spirit coming through. And, she paid money, but she wouldn't tell him. She actually gave her money back. She said, I can't tell you what he was saying. And as she was talking, relaying these messages back, she said, I'm getting these overurging messages to pick pints up. Quite astonishing, quite remarkable. But actually she did say, his sister did say to the spiritualist, look, is he in hell or is he in heaven? and the word she said to her was, "His ass is certainly burning."
Like, I actually, one of my singing students used to go to that Baptist church in Wakefield, and he was telling me about him, that he said, "Oh, you'll never get." Came for a lesson one evening and said, "Oh, you'll never guess who were at our church last night, Paul Sykes."
Yeah.
So I said, "Oh, okay." I said, "You know, what would he like with people?" And that, he said, "Well, he said he was a bit belligerent at first." He said, "But then he sort of came round a little bit and accepted that what those people at that church were doing was a kindness." But yeah, I mean, I knew. I mean, Chris, they call this guy, and his take on it was, he wasn't so much there for the religion. I'm not saying he didn't find it, because I don't know. He wasn't so much there for the religion. He was there for a bit of food to eat and a bit of shelter from the cold and things like that.
You've got a question on the screen, Lance?
Yeah, I have. I can see it. Did Sykes have a softer side? Have you heard anyone say good things about him? Was he capable of kindness? To answer you truthfully, Brad, I honestly have no personal knowledge and no extra personal knowledge, i.e. from outside sources, of anything good or kind that Paul Sykes did, and I'm sad to be able to say that, because there's not many human beings I think that I've met that I could say that about. But I never heard of him doing anything even remotely resembling being kind. And if he had a softer side, I think he must have reserved it for people who I've never come across, because I've never heard about it. I didn't know Kath, but I did know Wendy, and I spoke to Wendy, quite a few years before. And she was saying, "Oh, Sykes has been hanging around my house today." She says, "I don't know, what I'm going to do." And he was the sort of bloke that if you had him in your life, you couldn't get shut of him. But Wendy didn't, she didn't have anything to say at all, that what she wasn't negative, she wasn't slating him or all like this, but she didn't have anything to say that would remotely resemble.
And the flip side of the coin, so obviously you've been in Wakefield all those years, you lived through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the grapevine. Wakefield's not the biggest city in the world.
No.
Did you hear some of the acts of wickedness and the violence, or Sykesy's been in this pub and he's hit him? And was it like the grapevine? Was it always, in the city, the talk?
Yeah, there always a Sykesy story. He'd go in. There were I'm not gonna say his second name, but there a lad off Flupsit called Bernard, and he were handy enough lad in his own right, were Bernard, but not Sykes's league, But he were a big bloke, and they were in Eppie's one nightclub, and they won't have got in an argument, because Bernard wouldn't have argued with him, but he turned on Bernard for whatever reason, and he had him all. And my mate who'd witnessed this said he'd got his teeth around his cheek, and he said, "I'll bite your fucking face off." And this, that was just a regular night out. People would just leave pubs. They got that banning order for a reason. And taking you back to when I was talking about Les Carr, and Les Carr had a security company at the same time as me and Gavin, and he worked a lot of doors in Wakefield, did Les. And I don't know how official this was, but rumour had it that all the landlords had sort of got together, and basically you could check this when he talks to me again if it's true or not.
It's true. I've heard it before.
On a retainer, yeah. So that if Sykesy came in and he wouldn't leave, they could send for Les Carr.
Yeah. Gavin Etworth told me that story years ago.
Yeah.
Les would come in and go, "Right, Paul, come on, we've got to go." And normally he didn't with Les, for obvious reasons. But the last question to you. I mean, you saw the people interested in the free books, and there's going to be a film. We're going to put an update out, and I'm hoping next week. But I mean, people have read it on their website, Western Edge Pictures. If you Google it, the official synopsis. I mean, how do you find? I mean, you must get people now and again going, oh, because the Wakefield Express, they must have did about 4 or 5 stories off me over the years. And every now and again, they'll say, have you got an update? Have you got an And when he was alive, I remember talking to them when I went, because the Wakefield Express is only out once a week. And they'd say, oh, well, it's a bit boring and quiet, so we'll just go and find Paul and take a picture of him. And they told me that. I remember speaking to one of the journalists in 2017.
Right.
And I always remember when them first 2 books come out and they were bestsellers and they were doing good numbers. And Wakefield, Waterstones wouldn't entertain it. And I was like, why? So I went in and I was like, look, this book's doing this and that and it's supporting charities and all this. And I said, why don't you? And I'll never forget, they said to me, well, unlike some, we still remember him outside of our shop. So the people, I mean, he'd only been gone 10 years then. And I think a woman was telling me about how he was spitting at her and sat outside and he was barred out the shop. And he was just an absolute utter menace. Basically. But I mean, I don't know, how do you kind of sum him up when you see his name or you see the interest in him? And listen, it's not just me, there's millions and millions of views on YouTube.
How do I sum him up? I sum him up as being a man who was a waste of the talents that he'd been born with. I think, I mean, in the eternal sort of nature versus nurture debate, I think he was created, as I believe we all are. I believe that that nurture plays if he'd have been born in different circumstances, he would have undoubtedly been a different person. I think his legacy will always be one of people who speak highly in any way of him. I'd have to question their motives, and I'd have to question the relationship that they actually really did have with him, because he was a nuisance, and he was, and that's being polite. He was somebody who you couldn't have gone out with him on a night out as a friend, because the chances were that if he got that way out, he'd give you a good idea before the night.
I remember talking to do you know who used to drink with as well, though? And John Spencer, God rest him, good friend of mine who died. And he had Alex Higgins living with him for 6 months. And he said, I used to go out with them both. And he said Alex Higgins was worse than Sykes, but he couldn't fight, but he'd just get into trouble. But there was a football coach, manager years ago called Big Malcolm Allison. He would always ring John and say, when's Paul coming? He'd want to drink with him. And it's just, it's there was something I was going to say to you there. Listen, the interest in him is not dying anytime soon.
No.
And for a small time, even for just a small window, from 78 to 80, he did put Wakefield on the map for the right reasons.
He did.
Obviously,
I were in the army in that period. I watched that fight in my barrack room, and there were and all my mates around, and I was saying, this bloke somewhere, and we all watched the sort of the Gardner Sykes fight in '79, and you're right, Jamie. He did. He put Wakefield on the map for the right reason, for that very very brief period in history. But I think, as I say, I as charitable as I would like to be, I can't find myself to say much good about
well, do you know what? He fought. I mean, what's quite remarkable was he got out of prison and fought for the British title at 33, which was ancient in them days.
Yeah, it was.
you know, it's not like today with all the condition. 33, like you were an old man. And he fought for the British and the Commonwealth after spending 14 years on bread and water. I mean, he's a statistic for you, which I don't think a lot of people know. But from the age of 17 to just under 31, he'd only had 9 months at large. Yeah. You know, and in that time, he'd sparred with Bunny Johnston, sparred with Joe Fraser. You know, obviously, when he got out, he went over to America and fought Leon Spinks.
Yeah.
You know, he'd... yeah, I don't know. I mean, listen, do you know one thing what he did say, though? Do you know Kenny, the old tailor in the documentary?
Yeah.
So he said to me, I interviewed him a couple of years back, and he said he used to come in my shop, and he was a nuisance. You know, when he used to come in the shop, his shop would be empty because no one had come in. Yeah. Yeah. And he used to say, do you know what, Kenny? In years to come, people will come and write books about me, and they'll write films about me. God's honest truth. And, you know, he's right. But I'll leave you with this quote. I'll leave a story. So I interviewed a guy, I can't remember his name. He was a tattooist in Wakefield. It's in the book. Can't remember his name. And he was waking up. He was opening his shop. And it was, let me think, where is it? Bottom of... where McDonald's was, where Sykes... Anyway, Sykesy was asleep and hovering around his shop, basically being a nuisance. And he said, I turned around and I looked, and he was swaying from side to side. And he said, what the F are you looking at, you old has-been? And he kind of just looked up, and obviously hazy, drunk, and all. He went, better a has-been than a never was been. And he said, do you know what, for a couple of seconds, I thought, I can't come back with that, because he was a has-been. You know, I suppose it's not the criminal element, because that's nothing to be. Although Delroy Showers, I remember him saying, well, I was obviously very close to him, and he said, you know, notoriety in itself, I think I even said it in the documentary, the Duffy one, that in itself is a form of success. You know, he didn't have the cars, the women, the millions and all that, but I suppose 18 years on from his death, he's got the likes of us talking about him. So I suppose, you know, in some way or another, he was. He was. Yeah, that's what I mean. And, you know, I'm certainly not saying it's a good legacy to leave, but I think I'm very comfortable in saying this, that man, and I'm very fond of Wakefield. I know quite a lot of people from there. He will not be forgotten in our lifetime.
No, you're right. You're right. He won't. He won't. But soon he'll be confined to the annals of history, Jamie. Because, like, when my generation, I mean, like, you know, we were. I'm younger than Paul Sykes, but I mean, I'm 67 now, and so there'll come a time in the not too distant future where there won't be many people around still who actually did personally know him, who actually did, you know, they'll be, you know, they'll be basically talking about a person that they never encountered and they didn't live through that experience.
Do you know, you always think, you know, Bram Stoker did Dracula and he died penniless.
Right.
And basically, obviously, that's become a multi-million, billion industry over 100 years or whatever. And, you know, Peaky Blinders, who would have thought, well, like 100 years ago and 100 years on. And I think, you know, obviously I'm done with writing true crime now. I've got one more to come, Michael Showers. But I often think, you know, like, these characters are different. So, you know, I was chatting to Terry Stone the other day about possible Ellie Duffy film, and he wasn't even aware of the story. Right. But, you know, I know that obviously the people, Western Edge Pictures, they're obsessed with, you know, this. I mean, what are the chances of I did that book, 2017, first book, and I'll never forget when the War Cry said to me, so-and-so's been in touch. We've had a call saying, are you Jamie Boyle's publishers? We want to make a movie. And I was like, that just doesn't happen. It's about a 1 in a million chance. but it wasn't me. It's the book subject, and obviously, you know, it's like, listen, whoever going to do that book first, or it's like the Duffy one that's gone crazy, and there's a few out there. You know, I look at some characters and I think, Jesus, your story would be massive, but it's not worth the hassle these days.
Right.
But you know, he just wasn't a normal human being.
No.
And certainly from my aspect, I kind of like to study the psychological aspect and think, what the hell, why, who, when, like, what the fuck? Do you know what I mean? Like, how did you live your life through that and die in the gutter? Do you know what I mean? And I think it's imagine Lee Duffy being here now, full of bullet holes, and imagine the youth, imagine the message he could have got across. There's no glamour in this. Do you know what I mean? And you know, but I don't know. But listen, the interest, the PR train is going, and yeah, it's not stopping anytime soon. But do you know what, Lance? It's been an absolute pleasure, sir.
And for me as well, Jamie. Absolutely wonderful. Thanks
well, listen,
very much
when we get a film update, and you know, I know the film's going to be done in Wakefield, Pontefract, and Leeds. So we haven't had a film update for over 2 years, and maybe even 2.5 kicking on. So we need one. We need, you know, there's certain things that we know, but we're not allowed to say. But I'm just itching. It's not about the percentage we'll get. It's not about how many books we'll sell on the back of it. I actually just want to see a film. Do you know what I mean? And if it wasn't for Paul Sykes, you know, I've said this 100 times. I walked into the story. I met all the characters. And if I never kind of come across it, I maybe would never have written one book ever. And, you know, I was that kind of captivated with who, what, why, when, how. Well, do you know what I mean? I remember talking to authors and saying, why don't you, you know, and I actually just saw, I bought a dictaphone and thought, it can't be that hard. A monkey could do it. And, you know, obviously it's a lot harder than that, but, you know, I wasn't any author. I left school. I didn't even have an exam, my name. And you know, but it means a lot to kind of get your view. And, you know, I know we've followed each other on Twitter over the years, and, you know, and you saw some of the abuse and all that. And I remember you saying once, Lance, you said, well, it was a level view. Do you know what I mean? Because it wasn't glorified. I never ripped him to bits. No. It was just, you know, there was 50 in the first book. There was 34 in the second. And the only one in the third book was the police officer, because I knew that much about him that I could do. I think it was about 200 pages. So I knew by then, and, you know, the fiction, the tall stories, and there's a lot of grey areas of Sykes, you know. You know, Chris Lambrianou lived next door to him for 3 years, and it's people sit and make lies up and outrageous defamation, slander, and a lot of people on the internet they're not really brains, and they we'll believe it. Do you know what I mean? And you know, it's grown rapidly, and you know, certainly what he didn't achieve in his life, he's going to become huge in his death. And you know, when that film happens and it's at Leicester Square and all this, and he will be a household name like the Essex Boys and the Crays and the Bronsons and your Paul Ferris and all these kind of criminals that have had multi-million-pound films on, and it was just a matter of time, I think. Do you know what I mean? It's but you know, sometimes I've questioned myself, has it really been worth it with
I think it really has. Yeah, I think you've.
And but
I think as well. I mean, you've never really taken a side. You've been very impartial. And so I mean, I've enjoyed them all, and I've enjoyed the Lee Duffy stuff. And long may you continue, mate. And I wish you all the best for the future, Jamie.
Absolute pleasure. Well, listen, Lance, we'll keep in touch. And I will, obviously, I'm going to put, I think you follow the Paul Sykes page. It's got 34,500 on. So when the time comes for like the extras and all this kind of stuff, they'll be all posted on there. Well, yeah, absolute pleasure, Lance. So thank you so much, sir. Have a great weekend.
Pleasure, mate. You take care, Jamie. All the
God
best.
bless, my friend. See you soon. Bye.
You, mate. Bye. Bye.